In April 1912, the RMS Titanic sat at the docks in Southampton. It was the height of Edwardian engineering, a massive industrial feat intended to set a new standard for luxury and power on the North Atlantic. The ship was powered by 24 double-ended boilers, producing 46,000 horsepower. Its hull contained a series of internal watertight compartments designed to handle any breach. Looking at this sheer mass of steel, the public and the press reached a single conclusion: the vessel was indestructible. Yet, on its very first voyage, that steel gave way. The ship sank in the early morning of April 15th, taking over 1,500 passengers and crew with it. To understand how a disaster of this scale happens, we have to look past the collision with the iceberg. The Titanic was lost because of a series of human choices, a cascade of errors that started long before the ship ever hit the water. The failure began in the design phase. Because the Titanic was built to be unsinkable, the construction team treated basic safety measures as redundancies. They were viewed as extra features for an impossible scenario, rather than essential tools for survival. The ship carried over 2,200 people, but it was only equipped with 20 lifeboats. That provided a 1,200-person capacity, barely enough for half of the passengers and crew on board. At the time, maritime regulations actually allowed this. Authorities operated on the logic that lifeboats were only meant to ferry people back and forth to a nearby rescue ship. They never planned for a scenario where a vessel might sink rapidly and in total isolation. There was also the matter of appearance. White Star Line executives decided against installing additional lifeboats, specifically because they took up valuable deck space, preferring to keep the views unobstructed for the first-class passengers. The designers had built a system that only worked if the ship's internal features bought them days of time. They had planned for every possibility, except the one that actually unfolded. Once the ship reached the open ocean, the focus shifted from safety to reputation. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, wanted the Titanic to arrive in New York a full day early. He knew the headlines would be worth millions in publicity. Captain Edward Smith obliged the corporate goal, pushing the Titanic to maintain a dangerous cruising speed of 22 knots through the night. They kept this pace despite receiving 7 distinct warnings from other ships about massive ice fields directly in their path. In the radio room, the operator was swamped with a backlog of personal telegrams for the wealthy passengers. He was so focused on processing these messages that he ignored incoming ice warnings from nearby ships, telling them to stay off the airwaves. Even the lookouts were handicapped. A last-minute personnel change meant the binoculars were locked in a cabinet, and the key had been accidentally taken off the ship in Southampton. Between the pressure to make headlines and a shared sense of invincibility, a culture of complacency took over. Safety warnings were treated as inconveniences rather than life-saving data. At 11:39 p.m. on April 14th, that complacency met reality. The Titanic was traveling too fast to turn away in time. The collision damaged nearly 300 feet of the hull, opening the ship to the Atlantic. Water flooded the first 5 watertight compartments. This pulled the bow down, allowing the ocean to spill over the tops of the internal walls and flow into the next compartments, one after another. By midnight, the evacuation had begun, but it started with hesitation. Many passengers, still convinced the ship was safe, refused to board the tiny lifeboats and step out into the freezing night. This delay, combined with the lack of proper drills, led to disastrous results. Many lifeboats were lowered into the water half empty. Some launched with as few as 12 people, despite having room for 65. The evacuation was also dictated by the ship's social hierarchy. Third-class passengers were often kept behind gates in the lower decks, separated from the upper-deck lifeboat stations until it was too late for many to reach them. At 2:18 a.m., the weight of the water in the bow lifted the stern vertically into the sky. Moments later, the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface. The rigid protocols of the era and the prioritization of social class left empty seats in the lifeboats, while over 1,500 people remained on the ship. Only a few miles away, another ship, the SS Californian, was close enough to see the Titanic's lights. The crew watched white distress rockets fire into the air. But because they couldn't confirm if these were specific company signals, the captain went back to sleep, and the crew did nothing. The crew followed the letter of their rulebook while watching a visible emergency. They stayed focused on corporate signals while the reality of a sinking ship played out on the horizon. When the news of the 1,500 deaths reached the public, it triggered global outrage. The belief that modern engineering had conquered nature was gone. Inquiries later found that the disaster wasn't the result of a freak accident. The captain and the White Star Line had simply followed standard industry practices that had become dangerously outdated. This forced a transformation in maritime law. New regulations required lifeboats for every person on board, 24-hour radio monitoring, and mandatory safety drills for all passengers. The Titanic serves as a permanent warning. No system is indestructible if the people